Tensions are steadily rising in Iran as the economic crisis pushes people into the streets. Protesters are feeling public scares amid internet and electricity outages. Public buildings are being set on fire, and there are claims that more than 2,000 protesters have lost their lives. Meanwhile, sharp messages are coming from Washington. In this episode of Radar, we will examine the rupture unfolding in Iran and its possible repercussions for the region, particularly for Turkey. Our guest is Professor Dr. Yalçın Sarıkaya, head of the Department of International Relations at Giresun University. Mr. Sarıkaya, thank you for accepting our interview. First of all, how do you assess the current stage of the increasingly widespread protests in Iran? Do you think the United States is intervening in this process through an economic pressure strategy similar to what they did in Venezuela?
There is absolutely no doubt that the United States has been involved in the process unfolding in Iran. This is a very clear and undeniable reality. However, there are structural differences between Venezuela and Iran. Their conditions are different, and first and foremost, their geographies are different. Let me remind you that Venezuela is a country in the Americas and lies directly within the geopolitical sphere of the United States. It is located in a basin that is not far away at all. Iran, on the other hand, is a Middle Eastern country, or more broadly, a West Asian or South Asian country. Therefore, there are clear structural differences between the two. Nevertheless, when it comes to opposing American interests worldwide, resisting them, and developing positions against them, Venezuela and Iran can be seen as standing on similar sides. Of course, this does not mean that there is a political commonality that would allow intervention in both countries using the same tools. President Trump, who claimed that he came to power to end wars and to make America strong again through these means, nevertheless found himself compelled to attack Iran. This is particularly significant because from the 1979 revolution to the present day, there had been no direct confrontation between Iran and the United States, neither on each other's territory nor in a third arena, such as the open seas. Aside from a few incidents during the so-called tanker wars in the Persian Gulf, during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, incidents that occurred largely because Kuwaiti tankers were sailing under the American flag, there had been no such direct clashes. Yet Trump crossed that threshold as well, and, as everyone knows, carried out a very heavy bombardment of the Fordow facility. That said, it is necessary once again to underline the differences between the conditions of Venezuela and Iran. A foreign intervention signal from the United States at this level and in this tone may, in Iran, produce effects quite opposite to what is expected.
US President Trump directly addressed Iranian protesters by saying, "Keep protesting, take over your institution," and added, "Help's on the way." How do you think these statements affect developments on the ground? Do you believe the US is preparing for a military move against Iran?
The developments that began with the 1953 coup against Mossadegh ultimately gave rise to the anti-Americanism expressed during the 1979 revolution. Therefore, it is unrealistic to assume that Iranians would today view an intervention by the United States as a legitimate point of reference, based on the idea that America represents prosperity, peace, justice, and equality in the world. Of course, in a country of over 85 million, approaching 90 million, there will inevitably be some who see it that way. However, this does not reflect the general sentiment of Iranian society. The political line represented today by the President of the United States is not one that is widely admired, encouraged, or considered worth making sacrifices for. For example, even those segments in Iran who have, since 1979, been fundamentally opposed to the regime's policies regarding Palestine, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and who view these policies as a waste and squandering of Iran's resources, nevertheless harbor deep hatred toward Israel's actions over the past year and a half to 2 years, particularly its conduct and killings in Gaza. They also do not approve of the support that the United States provides to Israel. Certainly, we are talking about an Iranian population that is weary, exhausted, and increasingly distant from the system. a population whose trust in elections held in Iran has almost completely eroded. However, this does not mean that, at a single word from Trump or with a mere gesture of his finger, they would move to occupy their own state institutions.
If the crisis of governance in Iran deepens further or evolves into a process of regime change, how will this affect Turkey? What risk could emerge in terms of regional balances and security?
If the regime were to be shaken, how could this happen in Iran? I do not consider it very likely that the regime would collapse overnight and be immediately replaced by something new. As for Reza Pahlavi, the grandson of the Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, if there were any remaining traces of legitimacy or prestige in Iran simply because of his surname and his grandfather's legacy, I believe he largely exhausted even that by openly demonstrating cooperation with Israel and the United States during the 12-Day War. However, the Shah's grandson is not the only instrument. Countries that pursue certain objectives in Iran are not relying on a single tool alone. Other instruments could also be activated. For example, contrary to a widespread belief in public opinion, I do not think migration constitutes the main risk for Turkey. The Iranian people were not going to say, "There's a war here, let's force the borders and migrate to Turkey." What we observed during the 12-Day War was something quite different. If possible, people left bombed cities and chose to stay temporarily in villages, rural areas, or safer locations. There were no massive buildups at border crossings, no human floods. This situation is not comparable to Syria. However, if the country were to slide into a civil war, then the central authority could face very serious difficulties in projecting power to the periphery. This could occur due to geographical factors or because the overall order collapses abruptly. In this context, serious problems would likely emerge particularly in the eastern regions, in Baluchistan and the Sistan-Baluchistan province, among the Baluch population, and along the borders with Pakistan and Afghanistan. The breakdown of border security in these areas could bring along a wide range of additional problems. Similarly, along the Iraq-Iran border, even in the most recent protest demonstrations, we observe a concentration of activity, especially in what can be described as the central western part of the country, starting from Kermanshah and extending through areas inhabited by Lurs and Bakhtiaris, all the way to Avaz and the Arab-populated regions. Although protests have also taken place in cities such as Tehran, Mashhad, and Shiraz, in terms of frequency and intensity, the mountainous regions along the Turkey, Iran, and Iraq-Iran borders stand out. In these regions, attempts could be made, largely centered around Israel, to revive armed PJAK activities through Iraq, given the presence of groups with prior combat experience. It can also be said that the United States may provide intelligence and logistical support to such efforts. In the face of these possibilities, Turkey must act with extreme caution. Turkey may need to take measures not only for its own border security, but also in areas where Iran's border with Iraq converges, particularly in northern Iraq. This could require very serious aerial surveillance and patrol operations. In Iran's northwestern West Azerbaijan province, there may also be attempts to provoke ethnic conflict, specifically between Kurds and Azerbaijani Turks. It would be beneficial for both regional societies and Turkey not to tolerate such attempts and to take preventive measures. Likewise, further south, in areas such as Sanandaj, Bijar, Mahabad, and Sulduz, certain movements and provocations could be encouraged. Vigilance is required against such scenarios. In particular, no opportunity should be allowed for terrorist organizations to gain a foothold in these areas. This includes PJAK, the Iranian branch of the PKK, as well as other separatist armed Kurdish organizations operating in Iran. These groups exist in various forms. Even though they cannot operate openly, close attention must be paid to all of them, from the Iranian KDPI to more radical factions, including the group known as PAK. That said, if Iran were to experience a regime change and Iranians were to continue their path under a new system, Turkey would not lose anything from such a development. Regardless of how regime change is evaluated, Turkey holds significant advantages. Iran has much to learn from and gain through Turkey. Turkey serves as Iran's gateway to the West. Turkey has considerable strategic depth in relation to Iran, and a large segment of Iranian society is able to understand Turkey politically as well. For all these reasons, I believe Turkey would be in an advantageous position.
In recent weeks, Reza Pahlavi has released video calling on protesters, and Western media outlets have been giving him extensive coverage. How do you Iranian Turks view the scenario of a return of the Pahlavi dynasty?
Iranian Turks do not view a Pahlavi restoration scenario favorably at all. This is because the Pahlavi surname does not evoke positive associations for Turks in Iran. Until 1925, Iran had been governed for nearly 1,000 years by dynasties of Turkic origin. Reza Pahlavi, who came to power in 1925, was of Turkish origin on his mother's side, while on his father's side he was Persian from the Mazandaran region. However, what matters here more than ethnic lineage is how Iran was ruled under the Pahlavi administration and what policies were implemented. The Pahlavi state generally adopted a condescending and prohibitive stance toward non-Persian languages in the communities that spoke them, primarily Turkish and Turks, but also Arabic, Kurdish, and other languages besides Persian. The policies pursued by Reza Pahlavi in the 1920s and 1930s also contained racial overtones reminiscent of Nazi Germany. Emphasis was placed on Iran's connections with India and Britain, and concepts such as Aryanism and the notion of being an Indo-Aryan society were actively popularized during that period. As a consequence, Turks and the Turkish language were pushed back in broadcasting, the arts, literature, and religious literature. Cities in Azerbaijan, especially Tabriz, declined in their position within Iran, while Tehran and Isfahan were increasingly elevated and brought to the forefront. All of this occurred during the Pahlavi era, under both the father and the son Shahs. In this context, Turks, who throughout Iran's history had led or supported nearly all major transformative movements, also supported the Mossadegh movement in 1953, the Kiyabani Azadistan movement in the 1920s, the Constitutional Movement, and the 1979 revolution. Of course, Iranian Turks did not find what they had hoped for after the 1979 revolution, and once again suffered setbacks. Nevertheless, they do not live with nostalgia for the Pahlavi era. Therefore, the current Reza Pahlavi is not a source of hope for Iranian Turks. I can state this clearly and unequivocally.
Mr. Sarıkaya, thank you for your valuable responses.